Hello students, welcome to BYJU'S IAS. Welcome to the discussion on very important articles related to Indian economy that have appeared in various business related newspapers. For sake of clarity, I'll be using the articles from Hindu, Business Line, Financial Express, Livemint, Business Standard, etc. So let's begin this particular discussion. The first article is related to the foreign portfolio investments. Now, some of the basic points that you need to understand is one, the difference between FDI and FPI. Second one, what are some of the guidelines which are presently imposed by RBI on the inflow of FPI. FPI basically stands for foreign portfolio investment, whereas FDI stands for foreign direct investment. A layman understanding between both of them is one, FDI is basically a company, that is a foreign company, which invests in India's infrastructure. It could be in the form of manufacturing, it could be in the form of construction of a road, it could be in the form of a service sector orientation, so on and so forth. Whereas FPI, in some of the books, it will also be referred as FII, Foreign Institutional Investor. Please understand, FII is a part of FPI. So, FPI, Foreign Portfolio Investors, are nothing but foreign institutions such as hedge fund, mutual fund, investment funds, so on and so forth, which will come into India, invest in Indian stock market. And when I say invest in Indian stock market, basically they will purchase the shares of listed Indian companies in Indian stock market. So that is the basic difference between FDI and FPI. Now, whenever this kind of an institution, that is foreign institution, comes into India, it has to abide by KYC guidelines or know your client or know your customer guidelines, wherein this FPI has to approach SEBI, get registered under SEBI, and only then they will be allowed to invest in the stock market. Now, what are the different FPI guidelines? As per RBI, one, let's assume it's a FPI, foreign portfolio investor, and here is a company whose shares as well as whose other short-term instruments are present in the market. Now, one condition is, this particular company, whatever shares it has issued, the FPI can purchase these particular shares, but the limit will be 10%. That is, as per Arvind Mayaram committee, any foreign institution which holds up to 10% of Indian company in the form of its shares, it will be classified as FPI, or else it will be classified as FDI, foreign direct investment. That is the first. Second one, if this FPI wants to purchase the short-term instruments issued by this particular company. What do you mean by short-term instruments? Whose maturity period is less than 1 year, such as commercial papers, such as short-term debentures, such as short-term bonds, so on and so forth. Then there is a limit on how much this particular FPI can invest. As per RBI guidelines, if this particular company has issued, let's say hypothetically, commercial papers worth 100 rupees, then this particular company will not be allowed to invest or purchase commercial papers of more than 20%. In simple terms, more than 20 rupees. So, to put it in a statement form, a foreign institution cannot purchase or cannot invest more than 20% of its investment in short-term instruments of a single company. Third, the same FPI will purchase many short-term instruments of many other companies as well as the government. Now, there is a limit on how much this particular investment can be. The RBI guideline says this particular FPI, let's say X company, cannot hold investments in short-term instruments to more than 20% of its investment. To put it in an example form, let's assume this particular company X has invested a total of 100 rupees in the Indian market. Then RBI says, out of this 100 rupees, more than 20 rupees should not be held in the form of short-term instruments. Again, what are short-term instruments? The maturity period of these particular instruments is up to 1 year or less than 1 year. The best example for these instruments is commercial papers. That is one more guideline. And apart from this, RBI also says that there is a limit on how much FPI investment will be allowed into the government securities and how much will be allowed in the other debt instruments. So basically these are some of the guidelines or the limits which has been imposed by RBI on the inflow of a foreign portfolio investments. Now, why this particular issue is there in the newspaper? In the recent times, it has been seen that because of various issues, the foreign portfolio investments, rather than coming into India, there has been a net outflow. To cut this particular net outflow, the government of India as well as RBI already have announced a huge amount of measures. In addition to these particular measures, RBI now says there will be a new FPI route through which they will be attracting a lot of these particular investments into Indian market. Now, let's analyze this particular new route. The RBI calls this particular route as Voluntary Retention Route, VRR. Now, apart from VRR, what are the other existing routes through which FPI can come into India? One very important form is the NRIs, and the other very important form is FIIs, foreign institutional investors, and the non-resident Indians investing in Indian stock market. Apart from this, other important route is ADR and GDR, American Deposit Receipts and Global Deposit Receipts. And of recently, there is another route which was there in the newspaper, that is called P notes, that is participatory notes. So these are some of the very important existing routes through which FPI actually comes into India. Of this, which is the maximum right now? It is FIIs, foreign institutional investors. But in the recent times, it has been seen that there has been a huge net outflow of the investment by FIIs out of India. To curtail this kind of a flow, now RBI says we are going to promote one more route, that is Voluntary Retention Route. Now let's try and understand what is this VRR and what is the importance or how RBI is expecting to cut this particular outflow of foreign investments from India. In case of VRR, basically RBI says, let's say RBI will allow 100 rupees to flow into India through this particular route. The condition RBI levies is one FII or one FPI, let's say company X. If company X guarantees to stay for a very longer period of time and invest in Indian stock market, then I will allocate out of this 100 rupees a maximum allocation for him. That is, different FPIs or FIIs will approach RBI and ask permission to invest in Indian stock market. But RBI says one who promises to stay for a longer period of time in India, I will give the first preference to him in terms of allocating out of this particular funding. For example, this particular company, if it comes to RBI and says, I will invest for at least 4 years, and another company, that is FPI Y, comes to RBI and says, I will invest for at least, or let's say 3 years, then RBI says, I will prefer company X over company Y, and I will allow company X to bring in foreign portfolio investments into Indian stock market. But please understand, this particular limitation will be for a period of at least 3 years. That is two very important conditions that RBI has levied. One, the minimum tenure of investment, I'll call this as MTI. The minimum tenure of investment has to be at least 3 years. And second condition, a lock-in amount. What is a lock-in amount? RBI says at least 2/3 of your investment that you have brought into India, you will have to hold in Indian stock market for at least 3 years. Let's say, for example, a company X has been allowed to bring in 100 rupees in the Indian stock market. Now RBI says, out of this 100 rupees, at least 67 rupees you will have to hold in the form of India's investment for a minimum period of 3 years. This is the voluntary retention route. What is the objective of RBI here? It has been seen that because of various changes in the global scenario or global economic scenarios, the FPIs keep on coming into India, keep on going out of India. For example, post 2008 global financial crisis, we saw huge inflow of foreign portfolio investment from Western countries, especially from US economy. But now when the Fed tapering is being done in USA, the trade wars are going to increase, the currency wars are expected to happen, there is instability in the Middle East, we are seeing a huge outflow of FPI out of India into these particular Western economies. As a result of this, there is a destabilization in Indian stock market as well as the Indian forex market. How do I control or how do I reduce this kind of volatility? RBI says we will put a lock-in period in the form of tenure, in the form of value of investment. So this particular tool which has been introduced by RBI to attract foreign portfolio investment is called as VRR, Voluntary Retention Route. Now whether this will yield to a lot of inflow of FPI or not, we'll have to just wait and see. The next article is again related to attracting FPIs into Indian market. I've already taken care of what are the basic points, that is what is FPI, what is FII, what is FDI, so on and so forth. I've also discussed why this particular issue of FPI is there in the newspaper. Now let's try and analyze this particular article. It has been seen that whenever a FPI, let's say company X or institution X, which is located in USA, wants to come into India and invest in Indian stock market, they'll have to undergo KYC process, know your customer, know your client guidelines. And once the KYC process is over, the SEBI will issue a license for this particular company X to invest in the Indian stock market. Now the time period that this particular process takes is somewhere between 3 to 4 weeks. Whereas if it is a sovereign wealth fund, what do you mean by sovereign wealth fund? These are investment funds which are having the investment from the governments or the respective governments. The best example of a sovereign wealth fund is Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, or in case of a domestic market it is a NIIF. So these are usually referred to as sovereign wealth funds. Now in case of sovereign wealth funds, let's say Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, when it came to India to invest in Indian stock market, they were issued the license within a period of 1 week. In simple terms, if you are in sovereign wealth fund and wish to invest in Indian stock market, you will get the licenses or the clearances much faster compared to any other foreign portfolio investor. Now this particular time delay has been one of the issues why it is difficult to attract the foreign portfolio investments during this particular period of time when there is a huge net outflow of the FPIs. Now what the panel which has been set up by SEBI has recommended is we should also give these FPIs the clearances on a faster footing. In simple terms, we should provide the licenses in a much faster manner as we provide the license to the sovereign wealth funds. This is one of the biggest recommendation which is yet to be given by this particular panel to SEBI, and this article basically deals with these kind of recommendations. Apart from this, another very important recommendation which is expected to be given by this particular panel is that right now in which securities or which types of securities an FPI can invest is limited by RBI as well as SEBI. They decide in which type of categories, in which type of debentures, in which type of government securities, how much value should be allowed to be invested by this particular FPIs. Now this panel also says that apart from liberalizing the licensing regime for FPIs in India, we should also liberalize these kind of restrictions on the FPIs. The objective is if I give licenses much faster and if I give them the freedom to invest in many more types of securities, I'll be able to attract a lot of foreign portfolio investments into Indian stock market. And this will not only stabilize the forex market, it will also stabilize the stock market and also add to the forex reserves. So these are some of the important recommendations that have been proposed by this particular panel set up by SEBI. The next article is related to the Supreme Court as well as the repo rate. Now before analyzing the article, let's look at some of the very important basic points. RBI will announce monetary policy. Monetary policy is used to regulate the money flow in the system, and RBI will use a large number of quantitative tool or qualitative tools to regulate the money flow. But most important policy tool or the policy rate that is used by RBI to regulate the money flow in the system is nothing but the repo rate. What is repo rate? Repo rate is nothing but the rate of interest charged by a bank on the short-term loans given to banks. I'll repeat it. Repo rate is nothing but the rate of interest charged by RBI on the short-term loans that they give to banks. This particular rate is called as a repo rate. What is the importance of the repo rate? Repo rate will usually affect the lending rate of the banks. Now, whenever RBI will give a loan to a bank, the bank in turn will also issue these particular loans to the customers. And one of the very important parameters that affects the lending rate of these particular banks is their borrowing rate. And they borrow from RBI at repo rate. But having said so, this particular borrowing by a bank is not the only borrowing. For example, banks will also borrow from households. Banks will also borrow from companies. But please understand, repo rate variation usually affects the lending rates in the market. Now, this is a concept of a repo rate. Next one is the concept of lending rates. Now, there are different lending rate regimes which have been announced by RBI over a period of time. For example, back in 1994, we introduced the concept of a primary lending rate. And 2003, we introduced the concept of a benchmark primary lending rate. 2010, RBI introduced base rate regime. And the most important or the most recent lending rate regime that has been introduced by RBI is MCLR. MCLR stands for Marginal Cost of Funding Based Lending Rate. This was introduced from 1st April 2016, and any new loans which have been issued after the 1st April 2016, RBI says decide the lending rates on that based on MCLR. That is, each of the bank will determine their own lending rate, and based on their own lending rate, they will add certain premium to that and will issue these particular loans at a certain rate of interest. This is the concept of MCLR. Next one is monetary policy transmission. What is monetary policy transmission? Let's assume here is RBI. RBI will give loan to a bank. Bank in turn will give a loan to a customer. Now, if RBI varies its repo rate, for example, if RBI increases the repo rate, obviously the cost of borrowing for the banks will increase, and in turn they will also increase the lending rate on the loans given to customers. And on the vice versa, if RBI reduces the lending rate, banks should also reduce their lending rate so that the benefit is transferred to the borrowers in the market. To what extent the banks will transfer this particular benefit? Will they transfer the complete benefit to the customer, or will they transfer the partial benefit to the customer, or they will not transfer the benefit at all? This is basically referred as monetary policy transmission. If the monetary policy transmission is accurate or is high, it is called as efficient monetary policy transmission. And if the monetary policy transmission is very lazy or very laggard, it is called as inefficient monetary policy transmission. In case of India, despite RBI introducing MCLR, it has been found that the monetary policy transmission has been very inefficient. For example, Economic Survey states that in the last 2 years, RBI has reduced the lending rates by around 175 basis points. But the banks in turn have transferred this particular benefit to the consumers in the form of either 50 basis points reduction or to 75 basis points of reduction. So basically you will see that the monetary policy transmission has been very inefficient. Now, these are some of the basic points. Why this particular issue is there in the newspaper? One NGO, that is Money Life Foundation, has basically approached Supreme Court and has argued against the lending rates in the market. What are their arguments? Basically, they say that one, the way the banks decide the lending rates are very much arbitrary. That is one argument. Second argument is the banks will get the benefit of lower interest rates whenever RBI reduces the repo rate, and they will be very lazy to transfer this particular benefit to the borrowers. They will delay it, they will transfer only part of it, so on and so forth. But when RBI increases their repo rate, the banks are very quick to transfer this particular increase in the lending rate to the borrowers. Basically, please understand this, whenever a consumer or a borrower takes a loan, especially the consumption loans or personal loans, the rate of interest charged by a bank are under two heads. One is a fixed interest rate and the second one is floating interest rate. The meaning is hidden in the name itself. For example, in case of fixed interest rate, let's say X takes a home loan from a bank at a rate of interest of 10%. Throughout the tenure of the loan, the rate of interest remains fixed at 10%. Whereas if X takes a loan from a bank B on the floating concept or the floating rate of interest, this particular rate of interest initially could be 10%, but if RBI increases the repo rate, this will be increased by the bank. So basically what this foundation says is, especially to those borrowers who have taken loans on floating rate of interest, the banks are very quick to transfer this particular cost of capital or cost of borrowing in the form of increase in the rate of interest. But when RBI reduces the lending rate, these do not transfer or transfer very less part of it to the beneficiaries. So that is the second argument. Third argument is, the banks do not have any kind of a transparency in the methodology that they follow in determining the interest rates. For example, let's say bank X, on what basis does it decide its lending rate? Although there is an internal benchmarking, the borrowers do not know on what basis are they paying 16% rate of interest on let's say a home loan to a bank. So this particular foundation says, henceforth there must be transparency in the determination of the lending rates. On what basis? In what way? The foundation says that any bank which decides its lending rate, they should publish the methodology as well as the latest lending rate in their website. These are some of the arguments which have been put forward by this particular foundation in the Supreme Court. What did Supreme Court of India do? Supreme Court of India asked the viewpoint of the Reserve Bank of India. Now, Reserve Bank of India basically stated that they may direct or they can direct the banks to reduce their lending rates whenever RBI reduces the repo rate. This is the submission of the RBI. Now, the Supreme Court of India has basically given 6 weeks of time for RBI to come out with a submission regarding whether the rate cut benefits that were given by RBI have they been transferred to the borrowers or not. Now, this is the basic understanding of this article. Now, what can be done? One important committee recommendation is pending in front of RBI, which basically recommends external benchmarking. And the committee that I am discussing here or referring to here is nothing but Janak Raj Committee. This particular recommendation of Janak Raj Committee is in front of RBI, and Mr. Viral Acharya, who is one of the deputy governors of RBI, has basically stated that RBI is perusing or going through this particular recommendation. Now, what is the difference compared to the existing lending rate regime? Existing lending rate regime, that is MCLR, basically is referred as internal benchmarking. That is, RBI says follow these particular guidelines, take into consideration these particular parameters while you decide the lending rate. Again, RBI will basically give direction to a bank as to how they are supposed to decide their lending rate. But please understand, it is the bank which will decide their own lending rates, because the cost of operation, the cost of borrowing, the cost of lending, the expenditure incurred in other forms, the profit motive will vary from one bank to another bank. So RBI cannot simply say that X% will be the rate of interest for all the banks. And that is the precise reason there will be variation in the lending rate for the same kind of a loan from one bank to another bank. This is referred to as internal benchmarking. But what Janak Raj Committee has recommended is to shift to external benchmarking. For example, this particular committee says that the lending rates, if externally benchmarked, can be used in this particular form. That is repo rate plus other cost. Let's say there is a bank which incurs a cost of 2% in the form of operational expenditure and 6% in other forms. Totally other cost will be how much? 8%. And if the repo rate is 7%, the lending rate will be 15% for this particular bank. Now, apart from this, whenever there is a variation in the repo rate, automatically this particular lending rate will keep on varying. For example, if the repo rate is decreased by RBI from, let's say, 7% to 6%, automatically this will fall down to 14%. And if the repo rate is increased from 7% to, let's say, 8%, this particular lending rate will increase to 16%. So basically, this is the example of a external benchmarking. And external benchmarking is used in various developed economies where there is a much better transparency in deciding the lending rates. This will be beneficial for banking sector as well as provide huge amount of benefit for the borrowers mainly. So this is the discussion in this particular article. The next article is related to central government cutting the excise duties by 2.5 rupees in case of petrol as well as diesel. Some of the important points that you need to understand are: 1. India is heavily dependent on the import of crude oil. To what extent? More than 70% of domestic requirement is imported into India. Second, whenever the international crude oil prices will vary, it will affect the domestic prices of or the market prices of the components. Not every component, but especially petrol as well as diesel, because the kerosene as well as LPG prices are regulated by Government of India. In simple terms, Government of India provides subsidy on LPG as well as kerosene. The next point is, whenever the crude is imported into India, the various components are taken out or bifurcated. After bifurcation, let's say petrol and diesel, when they are supplied into the market, apart from the imported cost or the refining cost, the central government will impose the excise duty, the state government will collect sales tax or the VAT on it, apart from the dealer commission. As a result of this, the market prices will be much higher. Now, why it has been there in the newspaper? In the last couple of months, we have seen that the international crude oil prices or the Brent crude prices have kept on increasing. As a result of this, there has been an impact on the consumption in the domestic market in the form of increasing market prices. It has affected the forex reserves. It has led to expansion in trade deficit as well as expansion in current account deficit. The forex reserves are depleting, rupee is depreciating. So, keeping in mind these particular points, let's try and understand what would be the impact of this particular cut of 2.5 rupees in petrol as well as diesel by the central government. Now let's try and analyze this particular article under 4 heads. 1. Will it provide any benefit to the customers? Second, the fiscal deficit dilemma. Third one, what will be the impact of this on oil marketing companies? And fourth one, has Government of India started or restarted regulating the prices? The first one, will this cut in the excise duties by 2.5 rupees provide any benefit? On one side, some of the state governments as well as the central government has cut down the excise duty as well as the VAT by 2.5 rupees on per litre petrol as well as diesel. But on the other side, rupee depreciation has continued. The international crude oil prices have kept on increasing. As a result of this, majority of this particular benefit which was provided by the Government of India as well as some of the state governments have been nullified. The second one is the Government of India is worried about the fiscal deficit. For the financial year 2018 and 2019, the Government of India has set up a fiscal deficit target of 3.3% of GDP. But please understand, basically it can be maintained by ensuring balance between the expenditure as well as the receipts. On one side, the expenditure has increased because of a higher allocation or higher announcement of expenditure in various heads. For example, the expenditure allocation under subsidy, expenditure allocated for Air India, expenditure under Ayushman Bharat, so on and so forth. Whereas on the other side, the receipts under stress. For example, the GST, the target of GST collection was 1 lakh crore rupees per month. But in the last 5 to 6 months, we have seen that in none of these particular months, the target has been met. As a result of which, the fiscal deficit is feared to be expanding. Now, this will become a bigger headache for Government of India by the end of this particular financial year. The third one, out of 2.5 rupees that has been announced by Government of India, 1 rupee has to be absorbed by OMCs. In simple terms, out of 2.5 rupees, 1.5 rupees will be incurred by the central government and 1 rupee will be incurred by the oil marketing companies. As a result of this, it is expected that OMCs will have losses or under recoveries of more than 4,000 crore rupees. And finally, Government of India in the last decade or since the last decade has been deregulating these particular prices of the petrol as well as diesel. Presently, the prices of petrol and diesel are decided on day-to-day basis. That is a dynamic pricing. Every day morning 6 a.m. the prices are determined based on what are the prices of these particular fuels in the international market. But by going back and trying to adjust the pricing of these particular fuels, is Government of India again trying to regulate the pricing of these particular fuels? That is one of the issues that is concerned with respect to this article. But having said so, the central government has clarified that it has only tried to adjust the prices but not regulate the prices. To provide the benefit or the relief to the common man, the government has provided a cut of 2.5 rupees per litre petrol as well as diesel. But henceforth, it will not be regulating, which was done earlier by the central government. So these are some of the important points related to this article. The next article is related to the draft proposal of the central government to amend the Electricity Act of 2003. Very recently, it has issued the draft proposal and has sought replies or the viewpoints of the public related to this amendment. Earlier, back in the year 2014 also, the central government tried the same thing, but this particular bill is still pending in the parliament because the states are opposed to some of the very stringent provisions of this particular proposed amendment. Now, some of the basic points that you need to understand are: 1. The supply chain of electricity in case of India. Supply chain has got 3 phases: 1. Generation, transmission, and finally distribution. But to be more precise, apart from distribution, there is another phase which is called as supply. Now, please understand the concept of a distribution as well as supply. In case of India, presently, if there is a DISCOM, the same DISCOM is given the license to distribute as well as supply. What is the difference between the distribution and supply? I'll take an example. Let's assume this is a DISCOM office and this particular DISCOM has purchased certain electricity like this and it is yet to supply to a household. To supply to a household, it needs wiring connection, transformers, so on and so forth. In simple terms, it needs infrastructure or assets. Now, the distribution company will own these particular assets through which electricity will be supplied to the household. But once this infrastructure is set up, there is another company which will use this particular infrastructure to transfer the electricity. This will be called as distributor, which will own the assets, and the company which supplies electricity using this asset is called as supplier. But as already mentioned, in case of India, the license for distribution as well as supplying is given to the same company. That is, the same DISCOM will own the transformers as well as the lines which are used to transfer or supply electricity to the households, and the same DISCOM will supply the electricity using the assets. That is, in simple terms, single license is given for both distribution as well as supply. Next concept is the concept of cross subsidy. Let's assume here is a DISCOM and here is a household as well as a company. Both will consume electricity, but the difference is whenever the DISCOM sells electricity or supplies electricity to a household, it will charge lesser than the supply price or supply cost. That is, let's assume for a DISCOM to purchase electricity and to supply to a consumer in the market, they will incur a cost of 4 rupees. The DISCOM, when they supply the unit to this particular household, they will charge the household lesser than 4 rupees. Whereas the same unit, when supplied to a company, the DISCOM charges more than 4 rupees. This particular concept of subsidizing at a different level for different consumers is called as cross subsidization. Cross subsidization in India is done in case of electricity, in case of railways, so on and so forth. Next one is a concept of PPA, Purchasing Power Agreement. Let's assume here is a company X who is a solar developer or solar power plant developer, and here is a DISCOM which will supply the electricity to a household. This particular DISCOM will enter into an agreement with this particular generator saying that he will purchase electricity at so and so cost per unit. This agreement which is entered between the generator as well as the distributor and supplier is called as Power Purchasing Agreement. Next is a concept of RPO, Renewable Purchase Obligation. It simply means, let's assume here is a DISCOM, and if it supplies let's say 100 megawatt of electricity, the government may simply say out of this 100 megawatt, you will have to ensure that 5% of this will be in the form of renewable energy. So basically the DISCOM has to ensure that out of this 100 megawatt, 5 megawatt will be in the form of renewable energy. So this has been done in order to ensure that there is a market for renewable energy, and also to ensure that the dependence on the fossil fuel will be reduced and there will be dependence on the renewable energy. So basically this condition is called as a renewable purchase obligation. Now what is there in the news? As already mentioned, the central government has issued a draft amendment. That is the reason this is there in the news. What is the analysis? Let's look at some of the very important provisions which have been proposed in this particular draft. One, the draft says henceforth there will be separate companies which will be given licenses for distribution as well as supplying. As of now, what will happen? Same company which is having a license for distribution will also have the license for supplier. Right now the proposal is that the distributor licenses will be issued separately and the supplier licenses will be issued separately. In simple terms, within the same area there will be multiple distributors as well as multiple suppliers. The amendment says, or the draft basically says, that this will promote competition as well as the quality of the services which are available for the consumers. And based on their dependence, they can choose the supplier in the market as well as the distributor in the market. That is the first very important proposal under this amendment. Second one, it says that 24/7 electricity supply is an obligation on the DISCOM. The DISCOM is not doing any favor by supplying 24/7 electricity to the consumers in the market. And if the DISCOM fails in achieving this particular target of 24/7 electricity, then there will be a penalty imposed on this. The third proposal is with respect to cross subsidization. The bill says that the cross subsidization levels should not be more than 20%, and over a period of next 3 years it has to be eliminated. So that is the third proposal. Fourth proposal is with respect to subsidy transfer to the household. If any household is supposed to get a subsidy, the proposal says that it has to be transferred through the DBT, direct benefit transfer. And when I am discussing subsidy in this context, it is related to subsidy for a household for consuming electricity. Apart from this, there is also penalty provision if any of the stakeholders in PPAs, power purchasing agreement, violate the condition. So these are some of the very important provisions which have been proposed under this particular Amendment Act to the Electricity Act of 2003. So these are some of the important points related to this article. These are the articles which have appeared in the last 1 week in various business related newspapers. Now let's have a look at some of the questions. Let me start with the multiple choice questions. First question, consider the following statements. RBI decides the lending rates of the banks under MCLR. We have already seen this. The RBI gives certain recommendations or the guidelines based on which the banks will decide their own lending rates. That is the reason I have already mentioned this. Each and every individual bank will have a different lending rates for the same form of a loan. For example, you take a two-wheeler loan in bank X, the rate of interest will be different from the bank Y. The repayment conditions will be different, so on and so forth. So does RBI decide the lending rate? No, this is wrong. Second one, MCLR replaced BPLR. Please understand, earlier I said there was a concept of a PLR, primary lending rate, which was introduced back in the year 1993. This was replaced with benchmark primary lending rate in the year 2004, which was again replaced with base rate regime in the year 2010. This was replaced with MCLR. Marginal cost of funds based lending rate in the year 2016. So MCLR has replaced BRR, not BPLR. So again, the second statement is also wrong. Choose the right option, and the right option will be option D. Both the statements are wrong. Next question. Consider the following statements. As per RBI Act, MPC has to meet compulsorily 6 times in a year. The key term in this particular statement will be compulsory 6 times. Please understand, MPC is nothing but a Monetary Policy Committee. Now, as per the RBI Act, the MPC has to meet at least 4 times in a year, not 6 times in a year. So basically, this particular first statement is false. Second statement, in the MPC, the RBI governor has the veto power. Now, to understand this particular concept, Let me explain to you what is the difference between the present MPC and the older system which was present to decide the monetary policy. I'll basically use the term O, which means older system, and P, present system. Earlier, to decide the monetary policy, we had a composition of 1 plus 4. That is a total membership of 5 people, of which 1 will be RBI governor and 4 will be representatives of RBI itself. Whereas in the present context, the MPC has got a total membership of 6 people, of which 3 will be representatives of RBI. Obviously, RBI governor is one of the member here, and 3 will be experts appointed by Government of India. That is the first basic difference between the older system to decide monetary policy and the present MPC. Second major difference is, earlier RBI governor had a veto power here. What do you mean by that? Let's assume out of 5 people, 3 people are of the opinion that repo rate has to be increased. Whereas one person out of 5, that is RBI governor, is of the opinion that repo rate has to be maintained same. Okay, that is status quo. Despite what is the opinion of the other person out of 5 people, it doesn't matter, and the opinion of the 3 people also doesn't matter. Why? The will of RBI governor will prevail over the will of remaining 4 people in the committee. Hence, it is said that RBI governor in the earlier system had veto power. He could simply nullify the viewpoint of remaining 4 people. Whereas in the present context, RBI governor has got casting vote. What do you mean by casting vote? Let's assume out of 6 people, 3 people say, let's maintain the status quo. That is same rate of interest, repo rate again. And remaining 3 people say, let's increase the repo rate by 25 basis points. Now there is a tie. Obviously, in which favor the point has to be made, or the MPC has to decide. In this context, RBI governor will be given 1 extra vote to decide. This vote is called as casting vote. So in the present context, in the MPC, RBI governor has a veto power. No, RBI governor has a casting vote. So again, statement 2 is wrong. Choose the right option, and the right option will be option D. Both the statements are wrong. Third question, consider the following statements about Competition Commission of India. Some of the important points related to CCI are: 1. It is a statutory body which had come into force because of a passage of a Competition Commission Act of 2002. This particular act was amended in the year 2007 and has come into force from 2009. This replaced earlier MRTP. MRTP stands for Monopolies Restrictive Trade Practices Act, which was introduced during Indira Gandhi government back in the year 1960s and 70s. Apart from this, another very important point is a Competition Commission of India has been set up to protect the interest of the consumers in the market. Majorly protect the interest of the consumers. And to protect the interest of the consumers, CCI, that is the Competition Commission of India, can regulate mergers and acquisitions, can regulate pricing of any of these particular companies, so on and so forth. Now let's have a look at this particular statements. It is a constitutional body. No, it's a statutory body. Second, it has replaced the MRTP Act. Correct. Third, it is applicable throughout the territory of India. No, this statement is also wrong. Why? Please understand, the document says that it is applicable throughout the territory of India except the territory of Jammu and Kashmir. So even the third statement is wrong. So only one statement, that is second statement, is true. Choose the correct option. Option A is the correct option. Now I have given 2 descriptive questions, again entirely based on the current affairs. First is the cut in the excise duties on petrol and diesel by the central government makes for good politics but bad economics. Evaluate. Again, majorly oriented on the current affairs. Second, Government of India and RBI need to implement structural reforms to control the menace of NPS rather than half-hearted measures such as a recapitalization package. Give arguments in favor of the above statement in 250 words. So these are some of the practice questions under MCQs as well as descriptives. Have a practice based on the information that you have derived from this discussion, the previous discussions, as well as the static concepts that you have already learnt. Thank you. Have a good day.